I think it was always, let's see what we can push. What boundaries can we break? Amanda Bynes has a character on her show, and the character's name is Penelope Taint. Well, taint, you know what a taint is. And Dan Schneider knew what that meant, and he intended for that to be a dirty word that they were getting away with saying. In the writer's room, he said, all right, we know what this means, but we're not going to tell anybody, okay? It's kind of funny. And later on, somebody from Nickelodeon was sitting in the writer's room. He goes, wait a second, Penelope Taint, is that the character's name? Why are we doing that? That's kind of weird. And Dan totally gaslights the guy. He's like, what? You are such a weirdo. No, that's not what we mean at all. Okay? Don't be nasty and disgusting. We mean like taint, like something was tainted, like it used to be good, but now it's bad. The stupid guy from Nickelodeon's like, oh, okay, I guess that's fine. No, it's not fine. You heard it. You know, it's not, of all the words you could use, right? Change the character's name. But no. And so you've got Amanda Bynes running around, my name's Penelope Taint. My name's Penelope Taint. You know, and it's like, God, that's disgusting, you know? Take that filthy word out of that child's mouth. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Denise. Today we're going to talk about Quiet on the Set. So last week we tried a new thing on this channel, and that is to talk about shows and documentaries and sort of some more things that are a little bit more relevant to the time that we're in right now. Quiet on the Set came out, I don't know, like a couple months ago, maybe just a month ago. But anyway, everyone was talking about it then. I didn't talk about it. But after I talked about Baby Reindeer, and so many of the themes in that show are about the price of fame and what the drive for fame can do to us. I mean, we will compromise so much for fame. And Quiet on the Set really sort of dovetails with that because it's sort of a different kind of thing. And a little bit less from the individual who wants to be famous and kind of more from the perspective of parents who are really willing to overlook what seemed to me continual red flags in order to keep their child in the business. And parents always say, well, you know, I want to be able to give them everything they want. They really wanted this. They really wanted this. Well, kids want a lot of things that aren't good for them. I know that there are people who were child actors and are okay now, but I am really struggling to think of even who one of them might be. And if they are okay now, they took a massive stint to go be a human being, and then they came back to the industry. So anyway, obviously the main point of Quiet on the Set is to discuss the predators in that industry. How much covering up goes on in kids TV and in the industry, but particularly the microcosm that they were looking at was Nickelodeon. I think that if they were to do another documentary about Disney, you would find just as many problems. I honestly do. Considering the fact that the main predator from this story went on to then be hired by Disney like that as soon as he was out of prison. So, questionable. But what we're going to do with this little series is we're going to go episode by episode. So these aren't going to be super long videos, but they're just going to be reviews of each episode and kind of like my hot take at the end of it. So the first episode introduces us to the main character of this series, Dan Schneider. Dan Schneider was a producer at Nickelodeon. And so the first episode introduces him. It also talks about the culture on set for the cast members and the continual play at getting Dan's attention, sort of jostling to be his favorite. Once he had a favorite, though, he pretty much stuck to that. And then finally, we discuss in this episode what it was to be a woman writer for a Dan Schneider show. And we talk about the way that he was really abusive in the workplace towards his employees, and just the fact that he created a culture that was extremely unsafe to work in the sense that you were not allowed to dissent in any way. If you questioned him at all, he took it personally and could fire you. And all of these people, everyone from the cast to the writers, to the kids, to the parents involved, continually let things go because the allure of fame of having a child who is famous, of having your name on this show because, being this big producer, of working for these famous people, of getting your foot in the door. You're being abused, harassed, underpaid the entire time. You see all kinds of things going on. You are being manipulated at every turn of the way. And you're like, but I want to be famous. But fame's right around the corner. And it's like, at what cost to you? So that's what this show is. So it starts out, it introduces Dan. Dan was this chunky kid from Memphis. His dad had gone to Harvard. You sort of get this idea from the documentary that Dan's parents didn't think very much of him and probably let him know all the time that he had disappointed them. Everybody just thought he was kind of like this chubby doofus who was kind of going to bumble through life and not make much of himself. So in a pursuit to end that idea of him, he goes to LA, he gets on some shows, and he discovers that he is a good writer, and he manages to start writing this show that he's always on. He wanted to get away from constantly being cast in roles where he's like the chubby dumb friend. And he found himself in this sort of niche new world of children's television. So they were trying to, on Nickelodeon, create a show that was a sketch comedy. It was supposed to be a reflection of Saturday Night Live, except for kids. And he was approached, and would he help write this show? And for whatever reason, he seems like he has this innate ability to discover what would be funny for kids to watch. And, there are people who are like, yeah, he kind of seems like he has some Arrested Development himself. Like the things he thinks are so funny, like adults don't really get it, but the kids thought it was hilarious. So he had this real gifting for writing shows that kids would tune into over and over and over. And could not miss an episode. So he writes a sketch comedy show. And some of those really early shows, they had a couple of the actresses from that early show of his. I think it was called All That. All That was later revived later on, but the first iteration of it had several of the characters who came and talked in this documentary. It was Katrina Johnson. Now, Katrina describes the fact that Dan really took her under his wing. He let her know that he had chosen her and that, for all intents and purposes, she was kind of his favorite. At least that's the way she viewed it. Now, none of the other cast members kind of describe her in that same way, but she certainly describes herself as being one of his favorites and that he looked out for her, and that at one point, Dan and other producers had called her parents and said, hey, we want to make a spin-off show. We want to make a show called The Katrina Johnson Show. And so it was really this exciting thing for her. She couldn't believe how she had, landed the show. And so that Quiet on Set is talking about those early days when it was really fun to work at Nickelodeon. It was very chaotic. There's slime everywhere. They're like, there's all these jokes being played on set, very like practical jokey sort of set. Everyone's laughing, goofing off all the time. Even the tenor of Nickelodeon was very like kids rule. It's all about the kids. Grown-ups are dumb. Parents are stupid. They said that a lot. And basically, this is what the world would look like if we got to be in charge, It's a concept that as a kid, is sort of fun. But I think what's interesting is that in real life, the adults were acting like like the children on the shows. Like just everything seems like it was like whatever you want to do goes. Like we're gonna blow past child labor laws. We're gonna be doing weird, quirky things in the writer room. We're going to do whatever we want because there's no hold on this. In order for us to create children's television, we almost have to act like out of control children. Anyway, what I think is really interesting is we move from talking about Dan Schneider and like what a powerhouse he was. And he was like the it person as far as kids television goes. He could seem to do no wrong. He's writing all these kids shows. So Nickelodeon is so lucky to have him. He knows exactly what he needs to make. Everything's great. We move from that to the culture on set for the actual child stars. So if you know anything about this show, things get really dark by the end of the series. at this point, there isn't so much weirdness except from the adults, except for the fact that there seems like there's a lot of jostling to be favorites. And there's a lot of, I like you. I'm going to give that kid the side eye. I'm going to make that kid feel a little ostracized. I'm going to make that kid, I'm going to, through my actions, let that kid know he or she is not my favorite. And it seems like Dan from the show, I don't know that this is true, but from the show, it seems that if you were the black kid on set, sort of like the token black kid in the crew, you weren't given as much attention as maybe some of the white kids. That was said by every black person. So it wasn't like one person who perceived that they weren't getting as much attention. Every person seemed to say, with the exception of Giovanni, she didn't seem like she felt this as much, but it seemed like if you were black, you were sort of like, we hired you because we had to. But I'm not going to like carve out opportunities for you or anything. That was kind of the unspoken feeling. But the main theme here is that previously, Katrina Johnson had been a favorite of Dan Schneider. At one point, her parents got a call. We want to make a show for her. Then they get another call. She's getting too fat. We've already got a chubby girl on cast. Already got a fat kid. We don't need another fat kid. You're going to need to get it under control. And her parents said, well, she's dancing 6 days a week. I mean, we don't know what you want us to do. And so, they thought nothing of letting a child know you're gross, or, just talking down to a kid. Like, there was a lot of talking down to letting people feel like you're an idiot, just saying it, but then acting like we're just joking. Like, can't you take a joke? Like, that was a lot of what went on here was when people say something really hateful to you and they're like, just kidding. We're just joking, And so that's the power dynamic of having adults talk to you like that when you're a kid. It's like, first of all, already we've got this power differential. A kid is not going to necessarily talk back to an authority figure if that authority figure has promised them everything they ever wanted. In that situation, what child's going to say something to the adult? And if the adult insults them or talks down to them or is rude to them, and then it's just like, oh, I'm just kidding. Come on, you got to take a joke. Stop crying about it. Then the kid's never going to say anything. They don't want to be the squeaky wheel, especially when it's so clear that favorites are constantly being made. Katrina Johnson had been the favorite of Dan Schneider, but then she gets chubby, but then she hits puberty. And once she hit puberty, it was like, this is like for young. This is like our target audience is 6 to 11. Now you're looking like a young woman, and this just isn't, we don't have any programming for you here, So they kind of scoot her out. What I think is really interesting is Katrina Johnson had a real kind of bitterness in her voice when she talked about it. And what I'm astounded at is the entire portion of that documentary is talking about how manipulative and gaslighty Dan Schneider was. And how if he was your favorite, he would, say, he would sidle up to you and say things like, you were my favorite and I got you on the show, and he would be overly complimentary to you. If he didn't like you, he would be dismissive. He'd be mean. He would say mean things to you. And then if it hurt your feelings, he would condemn you for having had your feelings hurt. He wasn't a good guy. And she's like really annoyed and upset that she sort of fell out of his good graces. But she also aged out of what they were trying to do on the show. So Katrina introduces the next favorite of Dan. And not only in the documentary, but literally in life, she is the one who said to Dan, hey, at the Laugh Factory, they're doing these workshops for child comedians. Katrina had been part of the workshop. She had met this girl named Amanda Bynes, and she told Dan, Amanda's really funny. You should see her. So Amanda comes to the Laugh Factory. She does this routine. Dan is there, sees her, and immediately thinks that she is perfect. Her timing, her comedic timing, the way she can tell a joke, her physical comedy, everything's exactly what he would want for a kid's show. And I remember, I did not watch Nickelodeon because we didn't have cable, except at my grandparents' house they did. And I remember Amanda Bynes was my favorite. I loved Amanda Bynes. I thought she was so funny. And I really liked her physical comedy, and I just thought that was so funny, and her timing was so funny, and all her little characters were really funny, and I just thought she was so much fun to watch. So I can see why, I mean, anybody who watched those shows back then, anybody who watched Nickelodeon at all, even a little bit, even me, who never watched any TV except when I went to my grandparents' house, knew who Amanda Bynes was, and thought she was hilarious. Well, Katrina's being edged out, Amanda's being brought in, and I would say that Amanda was by far way more than he had ever favored Katrina. He favored Amanda. And Amanda had the it factor that I don't think any of the kids on any Nickelodeon show ever had. And Dan knew that. And so he absolutely took her under her wing. And everybody else on set realized too that she was not even a close favorite. She was by far ahead of them as far, in this comparison of who's Dan going to choose. Katrina's out of the picture. And she's extremely bitter about it to this day. Anybody who watched that documentary, tell me, don't you think Katrina was a little weirdly obsessed with the fact that she had gotten edged out? But again, it's like Dan was a loser. Like, what do you want him to have chosen you for? It's just like, and you got too old for the programming they were doing. So even if you had been his favorite, a day would have come when he would have had to say sayonara to you. Anyway, Katrina's out, Amanda's in. And Dan took such a liking to her that it was odd. Dan is over here like when all the kids are in school, and they had to be in school for 3 hours a day on set, which if you've seen videos of that, I don't know how much schooling was getting done, but officially, they're going to school. The kids are all in school, and Amanda's nowhere to be seen. But they all knew where she was. She's hanging out with Dan, and if Amanda had ideas for the show, Dan would do them, and he was always giving her like the best of this, the best of that, until finally he gives her own show. So they have a spin-off show called The Amanda Bynes Show. And when they do the spin-off show, they need to bring some more writers on for it. And this character that Amanda Bynes was playing, and they really stress this in the documentary, this was like a new kind of character for a young girl. She's not being baby cute Shirley Temple-ish. This isn't the Olsen twins. And she hasn't reached the age of maturity where she would be doing mature programming. Or playing roles and things that would require more of her. But this is a role that she did where she is doing all these character pieces. It was another variety show. She's doing all these different characters. And it was the perfect show to showcase the amazing array of talent that Amanda Bynes had. So they bring on some writers to help with this show. But we've gone from Dan Schneider, the sort of boss that he was, to the sort of culture on set of competitiveness, to talking about the writers on set. And they brought on 2 new writers. It was 2 women who really jostled for this position. But crazily enough, they hire these 2 women and tell them, you guys are going to share a salary. We're not going to pay you both a full salary. Are you kidding us? You're lucky to even be here. You guys will split. So they're splitting a salary, and they're, writing for the show. And it was an all-out race, like nose to the grindstone. You don't stop. You never stop. If you even think about wanting to go home, you're shamed and verbally abused for wanting to. There's one story that one of the writers tells about how Dan said, okay, we're working this weekend. It's like, all right, well, they worked every weekend. And he says, when are you all available? And one writer says, well, I'm available at any time except for Saturday night. I'm having people over. So they all go to work. They're working. It becomes evening. She's like, hey, I need to go. I've got people showing up at my apartment like now. Dan completely goes off on her. He is so rude, so unkind, so condescending, like being like, oh, so you're just going to let us all do your work for you. Okay. Go and hang out. We'd love to all go home, but the rest of us take our job seriously. Like that kind of talk. So she leaves and she feels so bad. Like she's like, feels so guilty for going home. Like I'm I don't want people to think I don't take this job seriously, you know. And there's like all these stories that they tell about how condescending and weird and odd he was. There's a story about how he tells her, you know, he bets her $300 if she can eat 2 pints of ice cream in 30 minutes. And so she's like, I'm down for it, you know, because I'm poor. I only make half a salary and I need $300. So she eats the 2 pints of ice cream, and then he kind of like forgets about the bet, forgets about it. Later on, she kind of calls him on it in a jokey sort of way, and he like shoves her in his office, not physically, but it's like, me in here. And they have this conversation about how dare you undermine me? Don't you ever say, what do you say? You saying I didn't pay you for something? Are you're trying to embarrass me in front of my staff, trying to make me look like some kind of a skinflint? Like, what is your problem? You know, and she was only, I mean, she did want the $300, but what she'd said had just been kind of like this jokey little nothing, you know? And because he'd bet somebody else, who will kill that fly for $30? And she's like, I will if you know, why don't we just add it to your tab? It was a joke. Like the whole set was always joking. It was always like practical joke this and ha ha this and like jumping up behind people and scaring people. It's like you would think you could just joke about the fact that somebody owed you money. But oh no, if you're the one joking at his expense, suddenly the roof is falling in. But what was way worse than just kind of like bullying tactics was the fact that he seems like he loves to put people in a position where they feel humiliated. And that is a theme in all of his comedy. All of the shows that he's doing has people doing things that are like physically humiliating. Now, one could say that it's kids programming and kids think it's funny if somebody gets embarrassed or they get slime or they fall down or they like have to do like weird gross things. There was one show where the kids are like eating all of this sugar that's like pouring out of this hose or whatever, and it's like making this like weird slime and everything in their mouth because it would like congeal. Definitely a weird thing when you consider some of the other things that happened. We're going to talk about that. But like he was always doing things where people looked dumb. He was always doing these things where people were like having to be physically uncomfortable, but he also wanted people to be emotionally uncomfortable. He seemed to find to derive a lot of pleasure from discomfort of others. And so one of these things that he would do to show his power, because he was a completely manipulative, completely power-hungry individual, would be when they would be writing on your laptop, a message would pop up and it would say something like "scream hammers." And like you had to do whatever he told you to do. And so you'd like be like hammers. And then he would type something else for you to say that would be dirty. And if you didn't do it, he'd type it again and again and again. Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, like really stressing that you had to do this thing. And there was this sense that if you didn't do it, he would think that you were difficult, especially if you were a female writer in the room, because he made it clear early on, I don't like girls because 1, they're not funny, and 2, they're difficult. So make sure you play your part correctly in this room. And so that put this burden on the female writers, particularly because already they're working for somebody who thought they didn't have the talent to be there. And if you complained, then you were difficult. So you would do it. You would do the stupid, dumb, gross, dirty, debasing thing he wanted you to scream out and say, so that you could keep your half salary. And see, that is what I'm saying to you. What does fame mean to you? That you would degrade yourself for half a salary so that maybe you're famous, or maybe you get another job. Like maybe just go get a regular job, you know, where people respect you and nobody's asking you to scream out nasty sexual phrases to all of your coworkers, all of whom are men except for one girl who's also over here being mistreated and abused. Then there's this one story, and I know you guys have heard it, but I was just like, this is the minute I would have quit. If until this point I'd been living in some kind of fog of delusion that it was all worth it. This is when I would have been like, hell no. So they're in the writer's room, they're throwing around ideas. One of the writers, the same writer who ate the 2 pints of ice cream in 30 minutes and was never paid to do it, is talking about high school, telling stories about high school, which is appropriate because they're writing shows for kids, they're bouncing ideas off. Dan Schneider says, you know, it'd be really funny. why don't you lean over the table, pretend you're being sodomized and tell that story? Wouldn't that be hilarious? No, you stupid fat idiot. It wouldn't be hilarious. That's disgusting. And the fact that everybody sat around that table and laughed at it like, yo, this guy's got the craziest sense of humor. Never know what Dan's gonna say. Shut up, Dan. Like, I would have, like, flipped that table. I'd have been so angry. Like, what are you talking about? And not, I would have done that as her coworker, as any man at that table should have been like, Dan, that's not funny. Wildly, the atmosphere in this place was so geared towards anything Dan wanted. She did it. And I don't even blame her. I don't, because it's like, you do some crazy things in some scenarios. I felt really bad for her when they asked her about it because she was clearly embarrassed that it had happened. She didn't want to talk about it. Who would want to talk about it? I mean, probably like the most embarrassing thing that has ever happened to you, and you agreed to do it. You know, you agreed to humiliate yourself in front of everybody. And I mean, what kind of atmosphere would you have to be working in? What kind of desperation would you have to feel to agree to that? And the fact that everyone sat there and had trained themselves to laugh at something that isn't even funny. Like, what context would that be funny? Like, I'm sitting here straining my mind to think, how could I have ever, what scenario would I have to be in order to sit back and be like, you know what would be funny? You know, it's like, that takes a twisted mind, and only one person would think that was funny. But the fact that he could get a whole room tittering and laughing and being like, yeah, do it. That's a really funny idea. Bunch of idiots. You know, all of them so power hungry, all of them like drooling for fame. You know, that they would sit there and laugh at their coworker who is being humiliated for no reason. Okay. So eventually, she is fired because, once again, she had the transgression of having friends outside of work, and she went on a Sunday night to go to a Springsteen concert where they were opening the Staples Center, and she was really excited to go, and so she went, and for that transgression she was fired because apparently she didn't take her job seriously. You know, what are you talking about? You're going to a concert. You know, she'd worked all the way up until right before the concert, and she said, hey, my friend's picking me up. I'm going to a concert. She had told them that she had this to do. But oh no, they all acted, Dan acted like this, like she had just come and stolen his firstborn right out of his arms and threw it to the ground. You know, so out she goes. So she's fired. And then the other female writer returned for a second season of The Amanda Show, and she lasted 4 days. Because she was already on the hot seat with Dan, because she found out during the course of the first season that she wasn't supposed to be splitting her salary. It was against the law. And she'd called the Actors Guild, and she had asked or the union, anyway, and she'd asked them, is this okay? Are there allowed to be teams on this show? And they're like, no teams. Everyone gets their own salary. Well, Dan called her and raked her over the coals for it. Are you trying to take this company down? If I find out you had anything to do with this, I'll make sure you never work in this town again. And so she was already kind of on the outs with him. When the other female writer left and she was the last one standing, he made it his priority to humiliate her until he drove her away. He was always like leaving her out of the conversation, making sure she knew that she wasn't welcome within the hallowed halls of the male comedy writers. And, often he'd be in his office with all of the writers, and then she would be invited in, like, okay, what we're doing is this. Do you have any ideas? And at one of those times, all the guys had been in the room talking. They finally opened the doors to her, beckon her in, and she comes in. And Dan says, as an opener, hey, didn't you used to do sex phone calls? And she's like, no, I never did that. And he's like, yeah, you said that you did. Didn't you used to do that as like a side job, right? You said that. Don't say, you didn't. You did. And she didn't. She'd never done that. This was just something he'd come up with to humiliate her in front of all of those guys, and she quit. She quit, and then she brought a lawsuit against him for harassment, for abuse, for workplace violations, and she asked the other female writer if the other writer would write a letter on her behalf and, corroborate these events. Other ladies like, absolutely, I will. And she knew when she brought the lawsuit against Dan, it was over. It was never going to, she really was never going to work in that town again. But she was like one of the few people in this entire scenario, in this entire documentary, who had the wherewithal to say, hey, I'm a human being with some dignity. And who cares if I never work here again? You don't treat people like this. This is not the way the world should work. And people should be held to account for what they do. So to hell with working here. I have my rights and this is ridiculous. Well, she paid for it. She never worked again there. I mean, she works, but not there. Anyway, so that pretty much sums up that whole episode, except for the fact that throughout this series, at the beginning when we're talking about Dan, in the middle when we're talking about the tenor on set and the culture of Nickelodeon, and at the end with the women, through all of this is this theme that Nickelodeon is telling a lot of jokes. They're doing a lot of things that are weird, that have all these innuendos that kids would never pick up on. Even kids that are kind of savvy. It was so like kinky and odd that they would not have known what was happening. And I can tell you that I 100% would not have picked up on any of this. Even as an adult, some of these things people would have had to be like, hey, you know what's going on here? And I would be like, really? So there was a part of me initially that wanted to be like, is that really what they're doing? Or are we like looking at this with sick minds? By the end of this series, there's so much sickness going on that of course they meant all of this in a super sick and diabolical way. But like things like at the beginning of Nickelodeon, I think it really was just like a quirky kids show where they're doing a bunch of dumb stuff, Later on, they're doing a lot of things that are not, that you can't even be like, well, maybe they're just being like weird because like kids like stupid stuff. Maybe there wasn't really an innuendo here. Like, okay, like here's an example of an innuendo that I think they're just being weird. I don't think that they're being explicit or trying to, it's not a dog whistle to a bunch of predators out there. This is one of those things where you could just be like, are they just being weird because it's a kid's show, so they came up with a weird thing? There's this one episode that they do where it was like some show. I don't even understand why in the world this scenario was going down. But the kids are running around in this room and they're like, they have to drink all this coffee and eat all this sugar. And the coffee and the sugar are like coming out of the ceiling, like in these big pipes. As I say this, I'm like, maybe it is weirder than I initially thought. But anyway, so the kids are like running around the room. They're like guzzling all this coffee and guzzling all the sugar. And, on the one hand, you could be like, yeah, but it's like this funny scenario because kids aren't allowed to drink coffee and they're not supposed to have too much sugar. And so it's like, of course, the kids are going to like start acting crazy because they're having so much coffee and so much sugar and they're just wired on these drugs of coffee and sugar, And so a person could just be like, oh, it's just like this silly, stupid thing where the kids are like eating the coffee and sugar and they're not supposed to or whatever. When they ate all this sugar that is coming out of pipes, it would create this kind of viscous slime, this like white viscous slime that's like falling out of their mouths and stuff. It's very gross. Very gross. And when you see a lot of the other jokes that are in the vein of fluids that exit the male body, it becomes a lot more clear that perhaps this little crazy scenario where the kids are taking the sugar and eating the sugar and the sugar's turning into this weird white slime wasn't really an innocent little bit of children's programming. But as a kid, I would never have picked up on that. In a million years, I wouldn't have picked up on that. And quite frankly, I probably wouldn't even thought about it, except for the fact that they sort of frame it that way in the Nickelodeon show, right? So that's one of those things where you're just like, okay, was it really intended to be like weird, or was it just some dumb kids programming? But later on, like the trajectory of Nickelodeon is weird enough that it does make you wonder, because there's some stuff later on that happens with Ariana Grande when she was on Nickelodeon, which I didn't even know she was on Nickelodeon, but apparently she had been. And she's doing some stuff that's like, this is nothing. She is acting out weird stuff. She's squeezing this longish potato and like saying, I wonder if I can juice a potato. And she's squeezing this potato and like making all these noises and saying, give up the juice. And it's like, who's that joke for? Who thinks that's funny? Like, what is the setup where a person would think that any of that was even how is that related to the kids? With the coffee and sugar, you can be like, because kids aren't supposed to have coffee and sugar, And now they're acting crazy and wired on caffeine and sugar. But Ariana Grande in her room with a webcam, and she's sitting there on her bed and like squeezing this potato saying, give up the juice, and like making all these weird noises. What is that joke? And there's there's all of these scenarios, once with an adult and then later on with a child, Jamie Lynn Spears, who they're like squirting this goo right onto their face. And of course, that is supposed to be a reference to some adult stuff. And it's like, I wouldn't have gotten that as a kid, not in 1,000 million years would I have realized that, right? But there's all of this weird stuff that is happening where a person could say, what kind of perverts were on set of this? A great example of the perversion and the known perversion, not just like, oops, we just did a really dumb thing and we didn't mean it. Because I don't think it was ever, oops, we did a really dumb thing and we didn't mean it. I think it was always, let's see what we can push. What boundaries can we break? Amanda Bynes has a character on her show, and the character's name is Penelope Taint. Well, taint, you know what a taint is, and it's, a descriptor on the male body. And Dan Schneider knew what that meant, and he intended for that to be a dirty word that they were getting away with saying. In the writer's room, he said, all right, we know what this means, but we're not going to tell anybody, okay? It's kind of funny. And later on, somebody from Nickelodeon was sitting in the writer's room. He goes, wait a second, Penelope Taint, is that the character's name? Why are we doing that? That's kind of weird. And Dan totally gaslights the guy. He's like, what? You are such a weirdo. No, that's not what we mean at all, okay? Don't be nasty and disgusting. We mean like taint, like something was tainted, like it used to be good, but now it's bad. The stupid guy from Nickelodeon's like, oh, okay, I guess that's fine. No, it's not fine. You heard it. It's not, of all the words you could use, right? Change the character's name. But no. And so you've got Amanda Bynes running around, my name's Penelope Taint. My name's Penelope Taint. And it's like, God, that's disgusting, take that filthy word out of that child's mouth, right? Anyway, so you have all of these examples of adults thinking that it's really funny to be perverse with children, and they don't know it, right? So that's really going to set the stage around here for the perverts, because they're going to be getting kids to do things, and they're going to be nasty, and the kids won't know it, until they do, and their life is ruined. That first episode was crazy, but that first episode was as mild as they come. If you haven't seen the series, you don't know. But if you have seen the series, it's bad. It's bad. Now, the next time we come together, I want to talk more about what's going on with the parents here, because I don't understand how so many parents were just kind of okay with these adults pushing them out constantly. But this is the thing that I will say. We live in an era in which we are so much more protective of our kids because of stuff like this. So we know, watch out for the weirdos. They're everywhere. But would we have known it if these people before hadn't come before and been like, hey, if that person's asking for your kid's email address, maybe don't let your kids email them. Now, in my mind, that seems like an obvious. But I also live in this world in which it feels like there's a predator around every corner that's trying to come and get your kid. And so we are just a lot more internet savvy about what can and cannot happen. And in my mind, any parent that is letting their child email with another adult, that's weird to me. But I think that we did collectively trust each other a lot more than we do now. I think adults used to trust each other. Like, you wouldn't hurt a kid, because I wouldn't hurt a kid. But now we live in this day and age where it's like, you might hurt a kid, So anyway, that's what we're going to talk about next episode. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and we will talk again soon. Bye.